Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me today. My name is Yasmir Portier, and I am a higher education professional in the area of student services. In today's session, we will be discussing the student loan debt crisis. We're going to start by tracing some key historical elements of the federal student loan program, and we will also be discussing the present status of federal student loans. Lastly, we're going to discuss some plans for the future. So let's go ahead and get started. The GI Bill was passed in 1944 and allowed World War II veterans to pursue a college education at a free or reduced cost. The GI Bill is important to the federal student loan program because it represents one of the earlier relationships between the federal government and higher education. It was then that the federal government provided veteran students with funding to pursue post-secondary education. In 1958, federal student loans were offered for the first time under the National Defense Education Act. Student loans were initially intended for students in the areas of math, science, engineering, and foreign language, and this was essentially so the United States could compete on the global stage with the Soviet Union. At the time, the Soviet Union led the space race. The Higher Education Act of 1965 was created to increase higher education opportunities for low and middle income students. Under this act, the federal government established the Guaranteed Student Loan Program, which provided students with guaranteed government subsidized loans. In 1980, the PLUS Loan Program was created, which allowed parents to borrow loans for their child's educational expenses. The PLUS Loan Program was intended for dependent students and at the time had an annual loan limit of $4,000 and an aggregate loan limit of $20,000. These numbers are drastically different from today's PLUS loan limits. And just a fun fact, PLUS originally stood for Parent Loan for Undergraduate Students, which that acronym is now obsolete due to the PLUS graduate loans. As for the cohort default rate, this was established in the 1980s. This is particularly important for the federal student loan program because it held institutions accountable for the number of students who defaulted on their student loans. Essentially, if an institution had too many students who were defaulting on their student loans, the institution was at risk for completely losing their federal funding. At last, in 1992, the free application for federal student aid was created, better known as FAFSA, and this process streamlined student information so that the federal government could better assess the financial needs of students, therefore identifying the students who would need financial aid funding the most. Now that we've discussed some key historical elements of the federal student loan program, we are going to examine the current status of the student loan debt crisis in higher education. As of 2019, it is being reported that 44 million Americans owe $1.5 trillion in student loan debt. Student loan debt is the second highest consumer debt in the United States behind mortgage debt. There are more students in debt because of student loans than credit card debt and auto loan debt. 5.1 million borrowers are currently in default for a total of $101 billion. It is important to note that default numbers do not represent the percentage of students who currently have their loans in forbearance or deferment. What this means for those of you who may not be familiar with those terms is that students are no longer in school and they are not meeting the half-time credit requirement for an in-school deferment. Ideally, these borrowers should be making payments to avoid the accrual of interest, but they have instead chosen to use the option to defer their loan payments. Students are limited to the amount of times they may place their loans in deferment. Student loan debt is steadily rising among U.S. households, and the numbers are not projected to decline anytime soon. Although tuition costs are increasing, many students are in fact borrowing more than what's needed. In my profession, I work directly with students in relation to their financial aid accounts at the university. Frequently, I encounter students requesting to increase their student loans specifically for the purpose of getting a financial aid refund for non-educational purposes. Delinquency rates are higher for students of color and for students who attended for-profit institutions. Probably the most alarming is that student loan debt is particularly high for students who did not complete their programs. The student loan debt crisis is also accompanied by the repayment crisis, as many students are unable to keep up with their student loan payments, even after the completion of their degree program. Although the government has offered many student loan forgiveness programs, they don't necessarily deliver on their intended promise. As of 2018, 49,669 applications have been submitted for the Public Service Student Loan Forgiveness Program. Out of the thousands of applications, 74% of these applications have been denied. Many have been denied because students are not meeting the requirement for the program, or they have failed to include important information on the application. So far, out of thousands of applications, 420 have been approved for the Public Service Forgiveness Program, and out of 420, 206 have received student loan forgiveness. It is important to note that the first cohort became eligible for forgiveness in 2017. Another issue among students who have trouble repaying their loans is that students are choosing programs that do not provide a return on their investment. Available data shows that liberal arts and humanities majors account for the highest level of debt among student loan borrowers. This is primarily due to the fact that students of these majors borrow more to finance their education and earn less after graduation. Students who do not complete their education also struggle to repay their loans, as their financial situation generally does not change much from the start of their education up until the time they completely withdraw from school. Although the federal student loan program began with good intentions, it has certainly made for bad outcomes for many student loan borrowers. Student loans are available to students regardless of their income level or the income level of their family. This certainly gives many students access to higher education. However, students with lower income, even after graduation, struggle to make their monthly payments. Plus loans allow parents to help their child with their educational expenses. However, plus loans have no aggregate limit, and parents are often borrowing up to their students' cost of attendance, which can be very costly in the long run. This leaves many parents, who are empty nesters, with more debt than they can truly repay as they embark on retirement age. Student loans initially help make college affordable, but studies have shown that as federal funding increases, college tuition rates are also going to increase. This is because the more money the federal government gives students to attend school, colleges will make the assumption that students are able to pay the tuition rates. In respect to repayment plans, there are many options available to students. However, students experiencing extended financial hardship and are unable to keep up with their repayment option risk defaulting on their student loan. Unlike many other forms of debt, student loans cannot be discharged through bankruptcy filing. Also contributing to the high number of student loan debt are ineffective entrance counseling requirements. Nearly 40% of high debt borrowers don't recall taking loan entrance counseling within a given aid year. Entrance counseling also occurs at the beginning of a student's academic career. Generally, when students borrow loans for the first time, they are required to take the loan entrance counseling. However, in the years to follow, they are not required to take any form of counseling. Some institutions have implemented third and fourth year counseling requirements, but all institutions do not have this requirement for their students. The information provided during the counseling session is also not sufficient in preparing students for the harsh reality of borrowing student loans. Rather than emphasizing smart borrowing techniques, loan entrance counseling generally focuses on defining terminology relative to student loans. Institutions do not have the ability to place restrictions on borrowing for students whom they have identified as no longer in need of financial aid for the given aid year. For example, if a student's account reflects a zero balance, institutions are not able to restrict a student from increasing their loan if the amount is available for an increase. Another caveat of the entrance counseling is that it is done online in a time frame of about 20 or 30 minutes. At most institutions, students are not required to meet with a financial aid representative to go over the counseling. Also, the counseling is generally filled with general information on student loans and not very much information specific to the student's loan account. More than 40% of student loan borrowers are currently paying nothing toward their student loans. As previously mentioned, this number accounts for students who are currently in deferment or students who currently have their loans in forbearance. For these students, they are no longer meeting the requirement for an in-school deferment and are instead choosing to defer payment on their loans as well as accruing the interest on those loans. Out of this number, there are currently 11% of student loan borrowers in default for their student loans. Default means that the students have gone 360 days or more without making a payment towards their loans when they were required to do so. An alarming projection was recently released at the beginning of 2019, stating that the default rate is projected to reach 40% by 2024. Colleges have routinely advised students to place their loans in deferment or forbearance. The trouble with this practice is that students are only allotted a certain amount of time to have their loans in deferment or forbearance. While forbearance options are great for students experiencing hardship because they allow the student to not make payments and the interest does not accrue, the time allowed for forbearance is very limited. We are now approaching the time when most students who have been in deferment or forbearance for quite a long time are now going to be forced to set up some sort of plan and begin repaying their loans. It is projected that this will not happen, which is why data suggests 40% of student borrowers will be in default by 2024. High numbers of students in default essentially devalues the idea of higher education. Higher education once represented a means for one to obtain a sustainable life. However, we are now seeing students completing their education and are still unable to keep up with their student loan payments because they are not making enough money to pay back the amount used to finance their education. Financial literacy efforts are severely lacking in higher education within the area of student services and financial services. I have proposed a few solutions that may help combat the growing student loan debt problem for professionals in higher education to assist our students. Solution number 1 focuses on financial counseling and smart borrowing techniques for student loan borrowers. Instead of financial counseling merely focusing on information relative to terminology and student loan lender, universities, colleges, community colleges, and trade schools should begin the practice of counseling students on smart borrowing techniques. Instead of advising students of the loan limits they have as a first-time freshman, we should instead encourage students to utilize gift aid options and to only use student loans to fulfill the need that is not being covered by their gift aid. It is also important for representatives in higher education to discuss the selection of a major with a student as well as the return on investment. The idea is not to deter students from studying the majors that most interest them, but to discuss the students' options for financing their education in areas that they may not see a return to be able to pay back such a high amount of student loan debt. Also, mandatory requirements for loan exit counseling may help assist higher education professionals in reducing the student loan debts that we are seeing today. Currently, loan exit counseling is placed on students' accounts as a task to be completed once the student has filed for graduation. The counseling, however, is not required for the student to complete because the student will not be receiving any future disbursements as an undergraduate. What's recommended is that the loan exit counseling actually be a requirement and possibly prevent the student's final degree from being mailed out or prevent the student from being able to request a transcript. Loan counseling essentially represents the last time the institution may have direct contact with the student. This is the best opportunity as higher education professionals to engage our students so that they truly understand the responsibility of the loans they have borrowed throughout the course of their education. Student loan debt will continue to increase under the current federal student loan program. I have proposed some ideas to redesign the federal student loan program in order to decrease student loan debt in the years to come. If federal loan limits decrease, institutions will possibly increase institutional gift aid offers to attract students to their universities. Loan limits should vary based on institution. For example, community college loan limits should actually be less than university loan limits due to the lower cost of attendance. Rather than allotting $5,500 for a first-time freshman at a community college, the loan limit should be reduced based on the cost of attendance at the community college. If a student is attending a university, the loan limit should reflect the cost of attendance at that university within a reasonable amount. When students' parents are denied for the Parent Plus loan, institutions have the ability to offer the student more money in an unsubsidized loan that accrues interest while the student is in school. These loans actually place the student over the threshold that the federal government has given for student loan limit guidelines. The denial of Parent Plus loans should not result in an increase of student borrowed loans. Educational institutions should also be responsible for directly lending a portion of the student loans. What this does, it makes the institution more accountable for the success of their student because they are lending a portion of the institution's funding towards the student for their education. Therefore, if students default, they are directly defaulting on the education, on the institution, as well as the federal government. The need requirement for subsidized loans unfairly forces many students to borrow unsubsidized loans that accrue interest while they're in school. The federal government should analyze what is considered a need-based loan so that more students can qualify for a loan that does not accrue interest while they are in school. Also, institutions should have the ability to appropriately assess student loan debt among liberal arts and humanities majors. This is simply because students of these majors do have the highest debt out of student loan borrowers. Also, an increase to options for student loan forgiveness programs and a faster track for students to actually have their loans forgiven. The last section we will cover today are promoting options for alternative funding for students in higher education. Scholarships are a realistic option for students to fund their education. In fact, millions of dollars in scholarships go unclaimed each year simply because students do not apply. Financial resources within institutions should be readily available to help students search for scholarships online and even help them complete applications at the student's request. More often than not, scholar applications require students to write a personal essay. Academic advisors should be available for students to assist them in writing these narratives. Employer-funded education is also an option for working students. Students seeking out employers who will assist them with their education can help them in the long run to avoid taking out massive amounts of student loans. Also, institutions should promote self-help aid far more than what is happening. Self-help aid can help students pay some of their leftover expenses that their gift aid did not cover, or it can be useful for students who do borrow loans and assist them with paying back those loans while they are in school. Students should also be reminded that they should only borrow loans when their gift aid does not cover their direct college expenses. Loans should not be borrowed to cover non-educational expenses outside of their direct account costs. Attending institutions close to home may be another option for students who are choosing to go out of state and take out loans to cover the cost of out-of-state tuition as well as out-of-state housing charges. Living at home is a great option for students if they find that student loans are the only payment source for them to afford on-campus housing. Attending a community college for 1 or 2 years before transferring to a university is a great alternative to save money and also reduce the cost of aid to be borrowed to finance an education. Also, attending a trade school may be a good option for many students who may feel pressured to attend university and take out student loans to cover those university costs. That concludes our session for today, and I do hope you have found this information to be helpful and relevant to your positions in higher education. As higher education professionals, we must always keep in mind the best interests of our students in helping them be successful throughout their academic careers. My name is Yasmir Portier, and thank you so much for attending. Have a good afternoon.